Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Cornegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the double secret selection committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Don. Great to be here.
So our guest today is Dr. Morley Stone, who earlier this year became IHMC's Chief Strategic Partnership Officer. And Morley is recognized as an international leader in human performance and biomimetics. In his new role at IHMC, he is going to become our point person for developing public and private sector partnerships. He will also work with IHMC's scientists and research staff to help win and then coordinate the multitude of research projects that we undertake here at the Institute.
In today's interview, we talked to Morley about his time as the Chief Technology Officer for the Air Force Research Laboratory, as well as his stint as the Chief Scientist for the Air Force's 711th Human Performance Wing. We will also discuss Morley's early career and his biomimetics research, as well as his time at DARPA and his most recent work as VP for Research at Ohio State.
But before Ken and I get to our interview with Morley, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we're especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews. As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by Kiana. The review was titled, I Really Want a T-Shirt. That's a good title.
That's a good title.
The review reads, Dawn and Ken introduce listeners to such a range of scientists and studies. It reminds me why I need to always be in pursuit of knowledge. As a young woman in STEM and practicing bootleg science, it is inspiring to hear all the details about the scientists' lives and their findings. It is frustrating when I hear facts and figures without a reliable source. But on this podcast, I can hear information straight from the horse's mouth. I love how the podcast production allows for the speakers to continue their subjects no matter how dense. Thank you for making information available to the public. With aloha from Hawaii, Kiana.
Oh, wow. Well, Kiana, we indeed have a t-shirt for you, and thank you for today's wonderful review. Ken and I also want to thank all of our other STEM Talk listeners who've helped this podcast become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to our interview with Dr. Morley Stone.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm your host, Dawn Cornegas, and joining us today is Morley Stone. Morley, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
And also joining us is Ken Ford.
Hello, Don, and hello, Morley.
Hey, Ken.
So, Morley, you grew up in a small steel-producing town in Pennsylvania. What were you like as a kid?
Well, I think one of the things, I was always been good in school, especially science. I'm the youngest of 4 boys. We all wrestled. Some of my fondest memories are my mom whacking us with a wooden spoon to get out of the kitchen and quit breaking things. My father was a Korean War veteran. I think some of the reason that I have leaned towards national defense work, I think, is because of that influence. He was a heavy equipment operator in the war and then became the town funeral director. My mom initially taught English and was an artist and ended up working for a local department store. So I'd say since my father was certainly pragmatic and my mom was an exceptionally creative person, I like to think that I absorbed some of those traits from each of them.
As a youth, you played football and baseball, and like me, as you mentioned earlier, you eventually concentrated on wrestling as you got older. We've discussed this before, but can you share with our listeners why you're so fond of wrestling and why you think it's a special sport?
Well, I think it imparts life skills that are so valuable, especially today. And these are life skills like discipline and accountability. And I would saying personally, I don't think it would be hyperbole to think of it as life-changing for me. And in particular, it's the aspect, of course, the hard work, but the fact that there's no excuses is common in many individualistic sports. And I would say it's been so seminal that I've approached every job that I've had since then really with a no excuses mentality. And that was really manifest, especially in different leadership roles that I've had. I've always worked to make sure that excuses are off the table. And part of that is also asking yourself, how can I enable other success? But those are, certainly key lessons. Hard for me to think of another sport that is so influential in shaping people that way.
Agreed, Morley.
So, Morley, thanks to your brother, you packed your things into a van when you were 17 and moved to Dayton, Ohio. So, what's the story behind that move?
Well, was something that certainly looked like out of a Blues Brothers movie in terms of what it looked like with this beat up van crossing a couple states. But yeah, my older brother, Matt, was an Air Force officer. He was assigned to the Air Force Institute of Technology to do his master's degree. And I think he knew, and I knew as well, that it was important to be exposed to a different environment. And so he was kind enough and forward-leaning enough to open up his house for me to live with him and go to school.
That's cool. So, how did you end up going to Wright State as opposed to the University of Dayton?
Well, in a word, Dawn, cost. My parents hadn't put much money away for college. And as I look back in hindsight, I think the proximity of Wright State to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was a huge enabler from both a work and obviously career perspective later on.
So, when you set foot on campus, you had not decided on a major yet, and you definitely did not think that biochemistry was an option. And I'll tell you, I was a biochemistry major and didn't think it was an option either initially. But then one day, this girl at school told you about an ad on a bulletin board that she noticed outside of her classroom, and your life changed. Can you tell us the story behind that?
So sure, I guess referencing back to the pragmatic side that I got from my father, my brother that brought me to Dayton, he was married and had his first child on the way. So it was time for me to go and I needed a job. And so being the pragmatic side, this ad that was outside of a classroom that was brought to me by a girl was for an ad for a student intern position at the Materials and Manufacturing Director of the predecessor lab to the Air Force Research Laboratory. And as they say, the rest is history.
So I have to ask, what happened to the girlfriend?
Well, she became my wife, and in October, we will have been married 30 years, and we've now raised 2 adult children. Both were Eagle Scouts, and both are engineers.
That's fantastic. Congratulations, too.
Thanks.
As an intern, I understand you also had a boss at the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate who played a quite influential role in your career and your development. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. His name was Charles Lee. It's a very familiar name to those in the polymer science area. After leaving the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate, he went on to a very successful career at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, funding research in the area of polymer science. I worked for him starting my sophomore year in college, and then late in my junior year, he came to me and asked me, well, what was next? And at that time period, I was thinking about graduate school, and it was Charles who said to me, well, why don't you let the Air Force pay for that? And frankly, at that time, I didn't even realize that was an option, wasn't considering it, wasn't on my radar screen. And in terms of the timing of events, the Air Force was just starting a new graduate fellowship program called the Palace Night Program. And so Charles exposed me to that, and then I was one of the early entrants into that program. And I paid for my graduate school at Carnegie Mellon, and in return for that, I had a service commitment. But I enjoyed the environment, I enjoyed what I did, so I didn't mind that service commitment at all. And I think watching Charles' example and the role that he had in helping to shape my trajectory, it's certainly, you'll see a common theme that I think we'll touch on later in our discussion today, is that it's just the positive role that people can play in a career trajectory. And we'll see many examples of that, I think, as we go through our discussion today.
The Materials and Manufacturing Directorate, as we've mentioned earlier, is part of the Air Force Research Laboratory. And I think this might be a good point to talk about what the directorate does and then also what AFRL does more generally. You know, how is AFRL organized, what its role is, and then a little more specific about what the Materials Directorate does.
Yeah, the Air Force Research Laboratory, which was stood up in 1997 in its current structure, is organized along these technology directorates. Now, it's not something that people usually think of, so it's helpful to think of them as focused lab areas, if you will, that perform and fund research central to the Air Force and to national defense, science, and technology. In terms of what happens across that enterprise, it spans from basic research that's administered by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research in Arlington, Virginia, to key enablers like human, information, or sensor technology, to more platform-centric organizations like our Munitions Directorate or Aerospace Systems Directorate. And so in defense parlance, they execute science and technology, which is known as 6.1 through 6.3 research. And then like any other organization that's involved in doing research, one of the key things that they work with is how do you actually transition the research that they perform in the labs to actually make a difference to the warfighter.
So you kind of touched on going to Carnegie Mellon, but we're going to backtrack and talk about that a little bit more. After earning your bachelor's degree, you had a short stint as a materials research engineer at the directorate before heading off to Carnegie Mellon University to work on a PhD in biochemistry. So why specifically Carnegie Mellon?
Well, of course, there's the school's reputation, which is stellar. As I mentioned in the beginning, I was originally from Pennsylvania, so this was an opportunity to head back to Pennsylvania for a brief period of time. And again, I think the central theme of the role of people. So my girlfriend, then later become my wife, while she was still my girlfriend, we went up to Argonne National Lab and went to a graduate school fair there. And as you might imagine, in a graduate school fair like this, there was a large auditorium that was filled with displays from various schools and different school recruiters. And there in that auditorium, I met Eric Rotzinger. So Eric was there representing Carnegie Mellon, and I tell you, his enthusiasm for the school was infectious. And I came away from that graduate school fair, of course, with a lot of school information in my hand, but that really moved Carnegie Mellon to the top. And in hindsight, I look back on that, it's one of the best decisions I ever made because of my early exposure to multidisciplinary work at the university.
And kind of expanding on that theme of people and their influence on your life, in the late 80s and early 90s, you had the good fortune to work with scientists who had the foresight to know that there was going to be a radical change in material science, which up until that point had been dominated by metals and ceramics. So what did you learn from these colleagues and mentors?
I think what really strikes me as I look back on that period, just how visionary they were. And by visionary, again, as you mentioned, while much of material science was dominated by metals and ceramics, they knew that there was a growing revolution in soft matter materials. And in particular, with the growth of soft matter materials, there was also going to be a line of work looking at the role of both bio-inspired and bio-derived materials as part of that portfolio as well. So that leadership, again, in being as visionary as they were, tapped me to be a part of that, and that really influenced my work at Carnegie Mellon. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I had a commitment period to pay back, and so I was fortunate enough and given the support to come back and begin to start work in bio-inspired materials. But I guess one other thing I would add to that is, and again, I've appreciated through the lens of time, and it's the critical role our defense and national labs play in defining the future. As exemplified by the story I just told you, they take risks that more conservative funding agencies don't. And as a result, they're often at the forefront of these emerging tech areas. And that's a huge role that they play that I think most people don't usually appreciate.
Yeah. And it's pretty obvious that you made a good impression at the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate when you were an undergraduate, because after earning your PhD, you spent the next decade at the Directorate as a research biologist and eventually became the lab's principal research biologist. Can you tell us a little bit about that period?
Well, looking back, it was certainly a wonderful period, much like beginning an academic lab would be in terms of building a lab, writing proposals to get funding support, hiring staff, buying equipment, setting up different research thrusts. And again, as I've referenced before, that was all made possible because of the tremendous amount of support I had from all levels of leadership. I look back and I think of things that I took as ordinary, but were really anything but. They were examples like having my branch chief meet me at the front door of the lab the first day that I showed up. And that same person, her name is Pam Schaefer at the time, came to me also that very first week and said, guess what? I'm going to take you to Washington and I'm going to teach you how to ride the metro. I'm going to show you where the funding agencies are. And again, that's just extraordinary leadership that she showed. And to me, very influential in terms of how you can shape and treat people. And then I would also say that was also unique about that time period is that it had a great cadre of peers that pushed and supported each other. Remember that we would gather regularly for lunch and talk about upcoming Material Research Society meetings or American Chemical Society meetings, talk about recent publications, have a little impromptu journal club, incredibly intellectually stimulating. And look back, and these are colleagues like Rajesh Naik and Tim Bunning and Rich Vaya, and every one of them now is either a chief scientist or, in Tim's case, the chief technology officer of the lab. So I think we certainly benefited each other from that pushing and creating that environment that blended support with also trying to push our technical boundaries.
Your early career was particularly defined by your research into biomimetics. And within your mandate at the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate, it was really to do this and to look at instances where biology was able to accomplish something that we couldn't accomplish through conventional synthetic systems, study the biological exemplar and then see how something like that, using some of the tricks that we could learn from Mother Nature, might be implemented. Could you briefly introduce our listeners to biomimetics and then discuss the systems, particular systems that you looked at, which range from infrared sensing to instances of biological camouflage and I'm sure much more?
So as you alluded to, Ken, our mandate was really to see what biology did better or different from our current systems and figure out the how and the why behind it, reverse engineer, if you will. In the case of infrared sensing, one of the things that was intriguing to the program managers at that time is how is biology able to do this in an uncooled fashion? If you looked across our platform then and even today, so many of our infrared systems are cryogenically cooled. So how is it that nature is able to do this at room temperature or even elevated temperature and do it with exquisite sensitivity? And so from that launch pad, we started to ask ourselves, well, what are some other examples of where biology is doing things that are of interest, especially to the Defense Department? Of course, camouflage was an obvious place to look, and that led to a line of research that we did looking at the masters, if you will, of camouflage in the animal world, organisms like cuttlefish and squid and octopus. And again, a fascinating material system because of the ability to not only absorb different wavelengths of light, but to, through their musculature, actually control different wavelengths of light that are reflected, and to do that dynamically. And this led to wonderful collaborations with colleagues at places like Woods Hole Marine Laboratory and scientists there like Roger Hanlon. But then another area that we started to look at as well is so often we think of biological systems as carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, but we could look across the biological world and see examples of where they were also depositing inorganic materials and oxides and begin to ask the question, well, how is that happening? And that led us to start taking a look at one of the masters of that is the diatom, a unicellular algae that makes its skeleton out of silica. And about that same time that we were asking those questions, some seminal work was coming out of Germany, out of the lab of Niels Kroger, that was beginning to look at some of the molecular mechanisms that were involved in biomineralization. And so that's what got us on that path. But it was an amazing time also from the standpoint of having what I would consider carte blanche to be able to look across these different systems and figure out how we could learn and reverse engineer from them.
Sounds like a great opportunity, really.
Yeah, it was. And again, back to you don't appreciate it at the time. Looking back, just the central theme of support and freedom, which I'm very thankful to the Defense Department labs for giving me.
Yeah, those two usually are mutually exclusive.
Yes.
Well, Morley, the creation of nanoscale materials for advanced structures has led to a growing interest in the area of biomineralization. And during your time at the directorate, you specifically researched the process of biomineralization and the assembly of nanostructured inorganic components into hierarchical structures. And this process led to the development of a variety of approaches that mimic the recognition and nucleation capabilities found in biomolecules for inorganic material synthesis. So can you talk to us about your 2002 paper that appeared in Nature Materials, where you described the in vitro biosynthesis of silver nanoparticles using silver binding peptides? It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth pointing out before we get to the paper as well is what was happening in the late 90s and early 2000s around biomineralization and why it was such, say, an exciting time period. In the late 90s, there's pioneering work done by Dan Morse at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And his work on the abalone shell and understanding it as nature's composite was really starting to lay the framework for what an exciting area I think biomineralization was to become. Graduate student of his, Angela Belcher, went on to a career at MIT and was really a trailblazer in the use of a technique called phage display, which for those who aren't aware, a phage is a virus that's specific for bacteria. A particular type of phage had been genetically engineered to display large, random combinatorial libraries of peptides that could be screened to see if they could actually bind to a certain surface. And that was a technique and tool that we used to actually uncover these peptides that were playing a role in binding and nucleating silver. Again, aside from Dan and Angela, I mentioned there are individuals like Stephen Mann at Bristol, Joanna Eisenberg, who was leaving Lucent Labs at the time, is now at Harvard, Mehmet Sarakai at University of Washington. So there was just a lot of thought leaders that were adding to this growing body of work, showing that indeed biology could be a useful tool when it comes to nucleating silvers and silver in this case, but just metals and oxides and semiconductors in general. And then another part of the paper that was key was, and this is part of our thinking in always doing this work, was that biology, if we can take it out of the system, if you will, we could then control where we put it. So we can control the deposition. And hence that's the reason that we put the microcapillary patterning aspect into that paper as well. It is not in this paper, but it was one of the research areas that we also published on about that time. It's the basis for why we were looking at techniques like dip pen nanolithography in collaborations with Chad Merkin at Northwestern, because, again, it was going to be a technique that was going to allow us to control where we place these biomolecules that would have some type of deposition effect. And then as we got into that, the other thing that came to light was we can now begin to have the ability to control the phases of the resulting materials, which again, from a material science perspective is incredibly beneficial, because usually it's only specific phases that have a particular application in a technology area.
So, Morley, another paper during this time period, which we understand you're particularly proud of, appeared in Advanced Materials in 2004, and you and your colleagues had taken a protein that was responsible for thermal sensing and incorporated it into an array. So can you talk to the listeners about why you're so fond of this paper?
Yeah, it's one of those, it's not, certainly I'd say in the top 5 of citations of work that we've published, but as you point out, I'm proud of it because it's one of those instances in performing science and engineering where you see a wild hypothesis become reality. And in this particular case, so we were asking these questions, which again were quite wild at the time, even till this day, I think, which you asked this question, could we clone a thermally responsive protein, incorporate it into a prototype device, still have the protein be active and actually create an image thermal radiation? And that's exactly what we showed in this paper, and that we could take this thermally responsive protein, put it in a crude sensing array, and actually image a thermal source at the other end of the lab. Again, aside from proving the hypothesis, but we were demonstrating that, yes, it was possible to create a room temperature, organic, thermally responsive array. And that in many ways was the whole reason that we went down this road of looking at biological infrared sensing. So to actually see it translate into a device was very rewarding.
I can imagine. It doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
You and your colleagues followed up this paper with an article in 2005 that appeared in the Journal of the American Chemical Society. This study has been frequently cited over the years. And can you tell us about the significance of this paper that had the interesting title, Polypeptide Templated Synthesis of Hexagonal Silica Platelets? That doesn't just roll off one's tongue.
As scientists, we often have a unique talent to create the most awkward titles possible. In this particular case, this work was really aimed at trying to find a lower cost alternative to the work that we were performing. So many of the peptides that I referenced earlier can be quite expensive, especially if you're thinking about how can I scale this up into some type of industrial process. And so looking at the work with polyl-lysine, that was a way at which we could begin to scale up and perhaps get around some of the cost barriers. But the other interesting outgrowth of looking at some of these other substrates was the fact that a physical property of, in this case, the polymer polyl-lysine, like molecular weight, played a role in the process. So now from a process engineering perspective, if you will, we had another lever or dial that we could tune to begin to control the resultant material. And then around that same time, we had published some work in biomacromolecules that continued to unpack this role of looking at both chemical influences and physical influences in the process. So from a chemical standpoint, that's where we're talking about things like molecular weight or the degree of cationic polymer being used. And in the physical sense, we were looking at things like flow or hydrodynamic fields and the application of electrostatic fields. And what I'm proud about really in both of those papers is that we were starting to take this body of knowledge that we were discovering and putting that in tables that we could share with the community, such that if people wanted to go off and make this class of material, what were going to be the conditions that were going to be necessary for it in terms of molecular weight and environment.
So we're going to shift topics just a little bit, Morley, and talk about another role that you've played. So from 2003 to 2006, you served as a program manager in DARPA's Defense Science Office, pursuing high-risk, high-payoff research. And I'm sure that this was just an absolutely eye-opening experience for you as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about your time at DARPA and the programs that you funded there?
Sure. And, obviously it was a very influential period. Many of the lessons from DARPA have stayed with me, and I'll share some of those. I think the first, and Ken, you'll appreciate this, flat organizations work. I was coming from, obviously, the Air Force Research Lab. The Air Force, like every other part of the military, is not very flat. And so getting into an organization where it's flat, it's incredibly empowering. Turnover. So the turnover of personnel, that's a hallmark of DARPA. You have program managers that come and go. I'm a big believer that's absolutely essential for the injection of new ideas. And I think that's key to the magic that happens at DARPA is the constant flow of people and ideas. And I would say the last thing that stayed with me both right after leaving DARPA and through the rest of my career is just that the Heilmeyer Catechism is timeless. And again, it's one of those things where whether it's a small program or a large program, taking a look at the Heilmeyer Catechism is always a good idea. I would say that also in reflection that I'll use the term, you get to see Management 101 in work. What I mean by that is the old adage of you get good people, you empower them, and then you get out of the way. And if you're in a leadership position, you do the things that you can to actually move barriers and obstacles out of their way so that they can do the job that you hired them to do. I certainly saw that in action from my office director and the director at the time, Tony Tether, was a great ambassador for that. And then in particular, the programs that I ran there were in bio-inspired sensing, bio-inspired robotics, and molecular electronics.
Morley, you mentioned the Heilmeyer Catechism. For our listeners, could you elaborate on that a little?
Sure, Ken. So first of all, the name, it comes from George Heilmeyer. He was a director of DARPA in the mid-'70s, went on to a very storied career after that at Texas Instruments and other places. But he came up with 8 seemingly simple questions. And they're only simple on the surface. They become much more difficult when you try and answer them. For example, the first one starts with, explain what you're trying to do in absolutely no jargon or specific terminology. And again, when you challenge, especially I'd say younger scientists and engineers, tell me what it is you want to do, why you want to do it, and do it in a way that you don't have to rely upon jargon. You can really begin to push somebody to explain the significance. And I think another key component of the Heilmeyer criteria is to really explain why it's going to be game-changing in its nature. And then they also have this attribute of injecting, I'd say, programmatic rigor in terms of what's it going to cost, what are the go, no-go decisions, and really force people to think through that.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that, Morley. So in 2007, you became the senior scientist for molecular systems biotechnology in the Human Effectiveness Directorate, which is also part of the Air Force Research Laboratory. And as the senior scientist, you work closely with the Air Force's 711th Human Performance Wing to address the challenges brought about by advances in information technology and also biotechnology and nanotechnology. And a year later, you became the chief scientist for the 711th Human Performance Wing and were responsible for providing technical oversight of projects aimed at optimizing human performance and resilience. So can you talk about this period of your career?
Sure. I guess I would start by addressing some of the organizational management perspectives, and that it was It was formative. It was formative because, as you alluded to, Dawn, we're standing up the 711th Human Performance Wing, and it was a brand new organization. It came about by virtue of the 2005 BRAC. And BRAC, for those that aren't familiar, is the base realignment and closure that was passed in Congress. And so when you stand up this new organization, and by the way, we're bringing in elements into this new organization from predecessor labs that were in Arizona and Texas. Each one of those had their own storied, proud history. And so that's why I go back to, from an organizational management perspective, change management perspective, it was a unique time to be the chief scientist in the organization and help to figure out how do you assimilate these units and the disciplines that they represent and start to create an organization that is greater than the sum of its parts. And also from a technical standpoint, it was just very influential for broadening my perspective about human science. And in fact, we had a terminology then, Ken, I don't know if you remember it from the Scientific Advisory Board, but we talked about in this new entity and the new competencies that we were bringing in, that we could look at human science from molecules to societies, and just what an opportunity, transformative opportunity that presented technically. So up until that point, as I've discussed previously, my career was very much at the molecular level. And then you get in an organization like this, and then you begin to appreciate that people are a heck of a lot more complicated than molecules. And it creates its own leadership challenge.
Absolutely. And, people like any complex system can be usefully understood at a variety of levels of abstraction. And one level doesn't really explain the phenomena at the next level. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it makes it all the more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're living now at a time when nearly anyone can monitor and record numerous physiological data streams in their quest to become perhaps more physically fit or healthier or to perform better. People do this for all kinds of reasons. You have the Oura Ring and various other kinds of wearable devices. For decades, the Department of Defense sort of flirted with the concept of human performance monitoring as well as augmentation. But the idea, except for in a few instances, never really took widespread hold, I would say. In a 2011 report that ran in the Armed Forces Journal, you laid out a foundation for how the Department of Defense could play a leadership role in human performance augmentation as a way of developing what you described as the quantified warfighter. I liked this article and actually cited it in a 2014 article that I co-authored with Clark Gleamore for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Our article was titled The Enhanced Warfighter. So first you quantify the warfighter and then you enhance the warfighter. I hadn't really noticed that about our two articles that had very similar titles. At any rate, the Department of Defense is now taking human performance monitoring much more seriously. Can you talk about your paper and the changes you've seen since it was published roughly a decade ago?
Yeah, I think it's important to consider what else was happening around that time period that was very influential. First of all, we had an Air Force chief scientist by the name of Werner Dahm, who had really re-energized technology horizons. And for those that aren't familiar, think of it as a technology roadmap that the service should pursue over the coming years. So there was Werner Dahm's Tech Horizon series, and then that was followed by the next chief scientist, Mark Mayberry, who had published his Global Horizon series. And Ken, I think you remember that we were also part of a Defense Science Board study on tech superiority in 2030. And I bring this up because really all three of those studies were pointing to this direction that there was a coming change in human sciences, and it really we had to take advantage of that. And then layered on top of it, nothing focuses the mind like a crisis. And so across the Air Force fleet and some of the Navy platforms, we also started to see unexplained physiological events that were occurring in some of our platforms. And so there was the opportunity presented itself that, hey, maybe we ought to think about learning more about this human that's in this system. And so we had this driver knowing that we had to approach human science differently. And then we could also see the coming proliferation of sensors and the accompanying data that was just going to accelerate. And so that was going to create a unique opportunity. And that opportunity was one to, in my words, take a more systems engineering view of the human problem. And let's begin to implement a sense, assess, augment paradigm into how we approach the human in a system. And indeed, I'd say the quantification of human health and performance has just exploded since then. I think to the point now where the flip side's becoming much more prevalent, which is just because I can measure something doesn't mean I should. And that's where I see a lot of the community struggling now.
Indeed. People are measuring all kinds of things and often not well and making decisions based on unreliable measurements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think during this time period of setting up this view of the changing landscape of human science, I would say one of the things that was of most service to the community then and now is being able to provide a quality check, if you will, on some of the measurements that are being provided by these devices. Because, people will go to Best Buy or off the internet, order the latest, greatest sensor, but they really don't have an underlying feel for just how accurate and reliable those measurements are, the degree of variance, and then what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Definitely agree. So in 2018, you made a major career change and became Senior Vice President of Research at Ohio State University. I understand that initially there was nothing about this job that seemed attractive to you. So what changed?
Well, not quite nothing, but it was a small quantity. But once again, it was the people element. I was very impressed with the people I met, and probably most important, the mission. And I was looking for a way to fill, if you will, the mission hole that was left behind from leaving the Air Force and national defense. And I could see that at a place like Ohio State. And by mission, I mean the importance and impact of a modern flagship land-grant university and the impact that it can have on the state and the people it serves in that state. And this ranges everything from economic development to workforce development to healthcare and research. In many ways, the land-grant institution is the engine across the state to make that happen, and found that very fulfilling.
So, Morley, we recently had a small meeting at IHMC focused on TBI that we were all a part of. And I understand a young academic who was attending had a question for you. And she knew about your background at Ohio State, where you oversaw an annual budget of more than $1 billion in basic and applied research. And so she asked you why you decided to move from the lab to more of a leadership role. And I understand that you told her, and this is a quote, "I'm going to be very clear that there's nothing as fun as when you're a bench scientist." So Morley, I have to say, I definitely agree, but you did go on to explain to the scientists that at times you do come to a point in your career where you're willing to trade personal joy for an opportunity to have a larger impact. Before we talk about this trade-off, I think our listeners would be interested in why you think being a bench scientist is such a great job in the first place.
Well, I think that the answer to that is simple, and it's the joy of discovery. There's just really nothing like it. And I think in particular, when you get to, put in quotes, see something that no one else has seen before, it's magical and it's addictive. And I think there are many times I felt like a kid on Christmas morning couldn't drive into the lab fast enough, waiting to see if what I had set up the night before was going to become a reality or not. Don't let me kid you. There are also plenty of disappointments, but that joy of discovery there's just nothing like it. I always, and related to that, mentored our younger scientists not to take that for granted. I used to tell them that we're so fortunate to be in this career field where you get paid to think and discover. There's just nothing like it. And you ask them, what could be better? And at the same breath, also show appreciation to those that make it possible, from Joe and Jane taxpayer to people on the front line risking it all. It's not an entitlement. It's a privilege. And to never lose sight of that.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I once took a disheartened scientist here to lunch. His proposal had been reviewed by somebody who clearly didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. That's the worst, right? It's okay to get it rejected with really expert reviews, but if the person obviously wasn't qualified to review it and you worked on it for months and months, that's tough. So we walked to lunch, and he was very upset, of course. And on the way to the restaurant, every person we met, I stopped. People I didn't know, just like the mailman. And I thanked him for helping to fund this guy's research. And the mailman said, "I didn't fund his research." Oh yeah, you did. And you didn't get to pick it, but thank you. And the waiter, the same thing. And the chef at the restaurant, the same thing. And after about 3 or 4 of these people, the scientist said, "Please, you could stop now." I got it. I'm lucky. Yeah. These are the luckiest people in the world that are paid to think about what they find fascinating And it's easy to lose track of that.
It is, and I would urge them. I said, if you ever lose sight of that, next time you have a family reunion and there's that uncle or aunt that you see maybe once every 5 or 10 years, go up and tell them what you're doing. Explain what you're doing, what you get paid to do.
Yeah.
And they will look at you like, I can't believe you get paid to do that.
Yeah.
It always helps to calibrate.
Exactly. We live in a bubble, and you can become disconnected from the life that most people live. Mm-hmm. So following up on Don's great question there, what is it about the various leadership roles? You mentioned making a bigger impact, but what is it about the various leadership roles that you've had over the years that in general, I know each role was different, but what is it that you found the most rewarding, the larger impact, the mentoring, or all of the above?
Well, I think it's being able to help others experience that feeling. As I started out in our discussion today, I told you, first to admit, was extremely fortunate with the leaders that I was surrounded by. Not everyone has that. So in these various positions, if there was something that I could do to demonstrate, if you will, what I consider the right leadership, which was the ability to have them experience that discovery feeling, it was just incredibly rewarding. And I think it's also important to note that it doesn't necessarily have to be about a research accomplishment, but it's really the process of bringing an idea to fruition. As an example, when I was AFRL's Chief Technology Officer, I started a program called Inspire. It was a series of TED-like talks to showcase AFRL's people. That was really me enabling a couple of young engineers' idea to make happen. Both Dan and Carrie Ann had the idea for this. It was just the things I could do to help them bring that to fruition. And so it's a key lesson in terms of it doesn't have to necessarily be in the research realm per se, but in ways of helping the organization and helping the people excel in that organization.
Absolutely. In fact, the worst and most ineffective scientific leaders that have had the misfortune to come across have essentially become cynical and are functionally vacuum cleaners of passion. And rather than help grow the passion and help the young researcher have the excitement that you talked about and have these peak experiences, they're sort of cynical. And these are the folks that do the most damage.
Yeah. And I think there's nothing more criminal than people that steal that passion, or as you say, vacuum it up. It's just it's hard to witness and to take, and so that's why I'm wherever I've been committed to making sure that we can do our part to elevate those around us to compensate for some of those passion vacuum cleaners in life.
You can hear them coming.
I definitely agree with what both of you have said. So, Morley, in addition to your broader leadership skills, you've earned an excellent reputation as someone who is able to develop collaborations between industry, academia, and government organizations such as AFRL and DARPA, which, of course, makes you a perfect fit for IHMC in your new role as IHMC's Chief Strategic Partnership Officer. So, perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on how you see your new position and also why you decided to join the team at IHMC.
Well, I've always been a big fan of IHMC and the core competencies upon which it's built, such as AI and machine learning, robotics, and human performance. And I think, as we look back, and I'll look at you, Ken, I mean, when you started this journey 17 or more years ago with IHMC, it's hard to imagine that these areas would become as central as they are now to the research portfolio for the nation writ large. And so, again, I'm convinced that these are going to continue to shape our world and continue to expand. And so the timing's really ripe to form these new partnerships and expand old ones. And it's important to note that it runs the gamut from new university collaborations that we're setting up to discussions that we're in with federally funded research and development centers that have synergistic competencies to us at IHMC, to small and large businesses that can not only benefit from the research that IHMC performs, but also provide avenues for transition, which again, for every scientist and engineer out there, that's often key in terms of how do we get that discovery out into the world. And then there's always that magic in finding the right win-win scenario, because if it's done right, the amplification factor, that sum greater than the parts, is just huge. And then apply that to solve national problems. It just doesn't get any better than that. So thankful to be here.
Well, welcome. We're glad you're here. Long before you began working here at IHMC, you started a program you mentioned earlier during your time at DARPA that was really focused on biologically inspired robots. And now you're here at IHMC, and you're at a place where almost all of the work in the robotics lab is, in fact, biologically inspired. And one of your other passions, human performance. And this is another key area here and a really major research thrust, as you mentioned. It must sort of bring a smile to your face to look back on issues that you were funding at DARPA and then see them moving into the mainstream, but also to be at a place that does exactly that.
Oh, very much so. And I think sometimes people can be lulled into thinking that, in your case of bio-inspired robotics, that it's matured to the point where there's nothing left to do because they'll be seduced by some of the YouTube videos showing capability. But I tell you, when you get into it and you actually see how much further we have to go to make these platforms have true lifelike capability, just in terms of movement and path planning, you realize that there's just a tremendous research future out there ahead of us.
Absolutely. And so now shifting gears a little, you've arrived here in Pensacola and you've purchased a beautiful home and you've started to settle in. So what are you planning to do with all your spare time?
Well, first of all, I'm still looking for that spare time, Ken. But as newish empty nesters, we're certainly spoiling our dog rotten and enjoying that. Kelly and I and my wife, we really enjoy exploring, especially our state and national park systems. And while I mentioned we have 2 adult children, they're, say, adult-ish, and so we're still involved in helping them make that transition to full adulthood and enjoying every minute of that as well.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful.
That's awesome. Well, Morley, it's been so much fun talking to you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dawn. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Morley. It was great.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Well, so I've known Morley for a while, and actually I met Morley just before I joined IHMC back in 2015, but I had no idea about the fascinating research that he did with the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate or the work that he did with the 711th Human Performance Wing, and he certainly is a welcome addition to IHMC. I know everybody's happy to have him on board.
Marley and I are old friends, but let me rephrase that and say we are friends of long standing. I no longer like to be called an old friend. He is an exceptional leader, and we are all very pleased to have him on the team.
So if you enjoyed this interview as much as Ken and I did, we invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. This is Dawn Carnegie signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.